Ellen Frost. This is a question for Bill, but Ashley, you may want to comment. Bill, when you look at Asia strategically, and you think of this sort of subtle balancing between China, India, Japan, it seems to everyone that Japan's influence in Asia adds up to less than the sum of its assets. Its assets are enormous, the size of its economy, technology. Its production networks in Asia preceded China-centered production networks, and it has fashion and mangas and pop culture, you know, all this kind of stuff. But its influence is really below, less than the sum of those assets. And you've lived in Japan, you speak Japanese, and I'd love to know what you think causes this. I've heard explanations ranging from sort of broadly cultural and historical, you know, the Shimoguni Konjo island mentality, hesitation about World War II. And other people say, nonsense, it's all about bureaucratic politics. There's no coordinating function. There's not a sort of leadership style is a cultural factor, but there's also bureaucratic politics, stovepipes, and so forth and so on. Now you have Naoto Kan, you have Okada. Maybe that's going to change, and that's sort of my question. But Ashley, you might want to comment on Japan, after all, has a very respectable military force. And Japan is the one country where public opinion polls show some reservations about the rise of China, very definitely. It's not on the rest of the spectrum. So in that context, I'd love to see what you have to say also about whether Japan's strategic influence could or should grow, and if so, whether it will be in a sort of constructive direction.
That's not going to be a short answer, but I think I'll try to focus in on one or two things. Yeah, certainly the historic issues have become quite important in East Asia, and some of this has been, I think, manipulated by the Chinese. I think not at all manipulated by the Korean governments. Not manipulated by I mean, No Mu-hyun did a bit, but the Korean, there's enough, you know, sort of long-term boiling, sub-boiling Korean anger against Japan that at any point in the last, 50 years, I mean, we're actually at a fairly low ebb in terms of anti-Japanese feeling. The Chinese, it's been much more subject to domestic suppression. But in Southeast Asia, 20 years ago, there was significant suspicion, and it's been mostly grown out of with the changes in generation, I think. But honestly, I think the most important thing has to do with the long-term hub and spoke system that characterized East Asian security and economy. I used to say that Japan put its foreign policy in escrow for the post-war period. As you move out of this, there's I think that Japan's potential is, for one thing, people look forward and they say that it's now declining. But also, the types of political relationships and the type of leadership roles were never really accentuated or built up because so much of Japan's relationships, and even in trade until the late 1980s, were very much on this sort of hub and spoke story. And the same was true of Korea, the same was true of the Southeast Asians, and China was basically outside in a lot of ways, hub with the U.S. as the hub. And then there's a variety of domestic issues, which I think are not just a question of bureaucracy. I mean, one issue is in terms of trade, Japan is, there are a number of protected sectors that remain unwilling to open up and become sort of major markets. In terms of Japan's role in maintaining in macroeconomic leadership, if you think about the sort of classic Kindleberger things that you need in order to be the economic leader, Japan has never been and probably will never be an effective market for distressed goods, again, for some of these same reasons. And then finally, I know people in Japan who have a great interest in greater regional leadership, but I don't know very many. And I think a lot of it has to do, really it's a very rational cost-benefit analysis. What does Japan get out of quote-unquote regional leadership? And in some areas, you can imagine it gets quite a bit, and it's been the leader. There's no question that in all these macro things, the Chiang Mai Initiative, the Asian Bond Markets Initiative, economic review and policy dialogue, all of these things, it's been a leader. It's been a leader in terms of these of the infrastructure support funds and trying to provide public-private various infrastructure support things, and there's several other policies. And it's been a leader in terms of trying to promote use of environmental technology. But none of these things look like the things that you're talking about as leadership. And in terms of security, it's got security. There's no place to go with that. In terms of trade, well, it's got these internal limitations. And besides, the most important part of trade has to do with information technology trade, and all of this is completely liberalized because of the IT anyway. So there's, as you sort of go down the list of things where Japan could really profit by leading, I don't think it's all that obvious that they're making bad choices. But so that's a semi-long version of the answer.
I'll give you a two-point quick judgment. And I think in some sense the US project in Japan has been all too successful. That we transformed a country that traditionally would have looked after its own interests through self-help into a country that now is so comfortable with somebody else providing protection for it that it really doesn't need to do more. Which then raises the question of what would change it. And there are two sources of change. One is domestic politics, where someone comes in from the inside and says, I have a different vision. I don't see any movement in domestic politics that takes us there, at least not in the near term. The secular changes, who knows? Or the structures that gave you comfort begin to be less and less persuasive to your national interests. For the moment, I don't think the Japanese are faced with that choice. But the reason why I think there is concern in Japan, in part, is because there is uncertainty about whether what worked for the last 50 years will work just as effectively for the next 50. And I see over the next few decades an increasing degree of uncertainty in the alliance relationship, particularly if the Japanese see us moving towards what crudely might be called an integrationist agenda with China, which they fear might leave them out in the cold or be less sensitive to their interests. That will then bring to the fore the questions that we've avoided for the last 60 years, which is, does Japan need to do more for itself? Forget about the alliance issues. But again, I think these are questions that are incipient, but they're not pressing. But again, to tie it to some issues that I talked about earlier, it really depends on how we come out of this crisis in terms of our own leadership role. And if over the next decade we are unable to kind of get our act together, then the implications that the Japanese will draw from that will bring all these issues that we think at least resolved for the moment back in the front burner. The second? Yeah.
My name is Shoichi Cho, visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel. This is just perfect for me. It's not only because I'm a Japanese, but also I'm an expert on Russian energy. And I'd highly appreciate if you, well, my question is for Dr. Hadwell. I'd highly appreciate if you could elaborate a little bit more about the impact of financial crisis upon the eastern flank of Russia and Moscow's strategy toward Asia as a whole. I think when we talk about policy implications for the United States about Russia's positioning in Asia, we cannot avoid elaborating what is going on in eastern Siberia and the Far East. There are two specific reasons for this. This is actually a question for Dr. Ashley Tellis because this has a lot to do with U.S. foreign policy. Number one, despite the politically inflamed so-called Sino-Russian strategic partnership, Moscow has increasingly concerned about the possible overprojection of China's geopolitical influence over the East Siberia and the Far East. Number two, Russia's future largely depends on the speed and the success of developing its eastern regions, since it is unlikely Russia will be able to overcome its weakness of excessively dependent on oil. More than 70% of Russia's oil production have come from West Siberia until today, but West Siberia's oil potential is peaking as a matter of time. This is exactly what the Russian government officially admits. When oil prices are hitting historical high until July last year, Moscow was unprepared to listen to anyone in the world, but I think it is high time, against the backdrop of global financial crisis. The three of the biggest energy-consuming nations, naming U.S., China, and Japan, can make some kind of policy adjustment to Russia. For one thing, we could possibly exploit the Russia's oil and gas potential of the eastern part of the country in view of reducing the impact of China's surging energy demand. For another, we can possibly shape Moscow's ambition of projecting geopolitical influence throughout the Asia-Pacific.
Yes, I think the questioner is right on a number of points. The eastern Siberian reserves that Russia holds are key to its financial well-being, because the western area, the Tumen fields, are in fact at peak production or already in decline, and Russia is increasingly looking both toward eastern Siberia and looking up into the Barents Sea, where the major Stockman fields are to be developed. That said, Russia has, in terms of the joint venture strategic partnership relationship, it has had an on-again, off-again thing where it brought in Shell and others into Sakhalin, and then at the point where the projects were close to completion, discovered that some salmon had, I'm exaggerating a little, but some salmon had died in a creek, and this was an environmental disaster, and got ready to pull the license until Shell agreed to sell its share to Gazprom. It had the Stockman fields up for tender, and then it withdrew that when oil was at $140 a barrel, and now there are 37 tenders because these people, our oil companies, just don't seem to learn. They're back in there ready to develop Stockman with them. So it's a back-and-forth situation, and one that the last thing I would mention is I think that this strategic agreement to provide this dedicated pipeline to China, which has 100 million people in the border region along the Amur with Russia, versus 7 million on the Russian side, is just asking for political warfare in the future. But by agreeing to that supply arrangement, I think the Russians expect that in return, the Chinese will hold to a previous agreement that says they are not going to challenge the territorial integrity of eastern Russia, which was taken, after all, from the Chinese Empire in the late 1800s. So there are a lot of things that you're after, and we could talk all night on oil strategy. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to bring the proceedings, at least adjourn the proceedings. I want to just thank my collaborators in this volume, all of you, for having done a superb job. And we might call on you again, both in connection with events that we do for the book, and of course, for future volumes. I also want to thank all of you hardy survivors who survived the last 3 hours of very serious conversation. Thank you for coming here, and I'm going to yield the floor to Rich.